Jake walked into a dealership outside Charlotte expecting a simple decision: buy the car or lease it. He had been saving for months because his old vehicle was becoming unreliable, and he wanted something safer for his daily commute. The salesperson showed him two nearly identical SUVs. The purchase option required a larger monthly payment while the lease looked much cheaper. At first, Jake thought leasing was obviously the smarter deal. He could drive a brand new vehicle, keep more money in his savings account, and potentially upgrade again in a few years. But then he asked a question that changed the conversation. How much will I actually spend over the next 10 years? Suddenly, the monthly payment wasn't enough information. Jake started adding the down payment, interest, taxes, insurance, maintenance, mileage limits, lease-end fees, depreciation, and what would happen when the contract ended. Buying meant higher payments now, but potentially owning the vehicle later. Leasing meant lower payments, but another decision when the lease expired. Jake realized the real question wasn't which payment is cheaper. It was, which option gives me the transportation I need while costing me the least over the years I actually plan to use it? That was the question he wished he'd asked before walking into the dealership. Level 1. Leasing. You're paying for the part you use. Jake started researching what a lease actually meant. He discovered that a lease generally charges him for the portion of the vehicle's value he uses during the lease term, plus financing charges, taxes, and fees. That explained why the monthly payment could look lower than buying the same vehicle. For Jake, the attraction was obvious. He could drive a newer SUV without committing to owning it for a decade. He wouldn't have to worry about selling the vehicle several years later, and he could potentially move into another newer model when the lease ended. But then Jake read the contract carefully. There was a mileage allowance. There were rules about excessive wear and damage. There could be fees at the beginning or end of the lease. Most importantly, Jake realized that the lower payment didn't mean the vehicle was automatically cheaper. He was paying for the use of the vehicle rather than building ownership. That could be perfectly reasonable for someone who drives predictable miles and enjoys changing cars every few years. But Jake regularly visited family several states away and enjoyed long road trips. He realized his lifestyle might not fit comfortably inside a restrictive mileage allowance. The lease wasn't bad. It simply wasn't automatically right for him. Jake learned his first major lesson. Never choose a lease because the monthly payment looks attractive. Understand exactly what that payment buys, what restrictions come with it, and what happens when the contract ends. Level 2. Buying the payment eventually ends. Jake then calculated what buying would look like. The monthly payment was higher, and that initially made him uncomfortable. But this time he looked beyond the first few years. If he financed the vehicle and eventually paid off the loan, he would still own the car. He could continue driving it without a monthly loan payment, sell it, or trade it toward another vehicle. Jake remembered his uncle's pickup truck. His uncle had purchased it years earlier, paid off the loan, and continued driving it for almost another decade. Once the loan disappeared, he redirected the old payment toward retirement savings and home improvements. Jake realized that this was one of the biggest differences between buying and leasing. A lease usually ends with another decision: return the vehicle, buy it, or enter another agreement. Buying can eventually reach a point where the financing disappears while ownership remains. Of course, buying wasn't free. Jake still had to pay for insurance, fuel, maintenance, repairs, registration, and depreciation. But the longer he kept a reliable vehicle, the longer he could potentially use it after the loan was finished. Jake began thinking about the purchase as a long-term transportation strategy rather than a 3-year decision. If he planned to keep the vehicle for 8, 10, or even 12 years, the higher initial cost could potentially make more sense. The lesson became clear. Don't judge buying only by the first monthly payment. Think about the entire period you'll own the vehicle. Level 3. Mileage. How much do you actually drive? Before making his decision, Jake checked his driving history. He discovered something surprising. He drove much more than he thought. His commute, weekend trips, family visits, and vacations added thousands of miles every year. The lease he was considering included a mileage allowance, and Jake realized that exceeding it could create additional charges depending on the contract. He imagined signing the agreement and then accepting a new job that doubled his commute. Suddenly, the mileage limit could become a serious financial issue. Buying gave him more freedom. He could drive across the country, take spontaneous road trips, or increase his annual mileage without worrying about a contractual mileage allowance. Of course, high mileage could still reduce the vehicle's resale value, but there wouldn't be a lease-end mileage charge simply because he drove more than expected. Jake also considered his future. His current driving habits might change. A new job, a move, a growing family, or more frequent travel could completely alter how many miles he drove. That made a fixed lease allowance less comfortable for him. Jake realized that two people could look at exactly the same lease and reach completely different conclusions. Someone working from home and driving 5,000 miles a year might find the mileage allowance more than enough. Someone commuting 25,000 miles could have a completely different experience. The lesson was simple. Your driving habits are part of the financial calculation. Before leasing, Jake decided he needed to look at his actual mileage rather than guessing. A low payment isn't useful if the contract doesn't match your life. Level 4. The lease ends. What happens after 3 years? Jake imagined himself 3 years into the future. His lease had ended and the vehicle was ready to be returned. He suddenly faced another decision. He could return it and find another vehicle, buy the car if the purchase option made sense, or enter another lease. The cycle surprised him. Jake had originally focused on the low monthly payment, but now he realized that leasing meant continuing to make transportation decisions every few years. There was nothing inherently wrong with that. Some people genuinely prefer driving newer cars and don't want to keep a vehicle for 10 years. But Jake wanted to understand the long-term cost. He imagined leasing a new vehicle every 3 years for 20 years. He would enjoy newer technology and newer interiors, but he would also repeatedly enter new contracts. Then he imagined buying one reliable vehicle and keeping it for 10 years. After the loan ended, he could continue driving it without another monthly financing payment. The difference wasn't necessarily obvious during the first few years, but it could become significant over a longer period. Jake realized that how long you keep a car can matter as much as whether you buy or lease it. A buyer who trades in every 3 years may not receive the same long-term advantage as someone who keeps a vehicle for a decade. Jake started thinking beyond the first contract. He wanted a transportation strategy that worked across many years, not just one dealership visit. Level 5. Depreciation. The cost nobody sees. Jake knew cars depreciated, but he hadn't understood how important that was to the buying versus leasing calculation. A new vehicle can lose a significant amount of value during its early years, although the actual amount depends on the model, mileage, condition, market, and other factors. When buying, Jake would personally own that depreciating asset. When leasing, depreciation was still part of the economics behind the lease payment. It hadn't disappeared. Jake started looking at lightly used vehicles as another possibility. Instead of buying a brand new model, he considered purchasing a vehicle that was a few years old. It had already absorbed some depreciation but could still provide modern safety features and useful technology. He also realized that buying used could introduce other considerations, including maintenance history, warranty coverage, condition, and financing terms. There was no perfect solution. Jake's goal was to understand where his money was going. He wasn't buying a car because he expected it to increase in value. He was buying transportation. That changed his mindset completely. Instead of asking which vehicle looked impressive, he asked how much useful transportation he could receive for every dollar spent. He also stopped assuming that a low lease payment meant low depreciation. The vehicle was still losing value during the lease period, and Jake was paying for that through the structure of the contract. He began reading lease details more carefully instead of relying on advertisements. The sticker price, monthly payment, and depreciation are three different numbers, and understanding all three can completely change the decision. Level 6. The investment question. What happens to the money you don't spend? Jake's final calculation was the one most dealerships didn't discuss: opportunity cost. Suppose leasing required less money up front than buying. What if Jake kept the difference invested instead? That money could potentially grow over time. But Jake also understood the catch. Saving money on a lease doesn't automatically create wealth if the money simply gets spent elsewhere. If he used the lower payment to eat out more, travel more, and upgrade other parts of his lifestyle, the financial advantage could disappear. Jake created two hypothetical scenarios. In one, he leased and invested the difference. In the other, he bought and kept the vehicle for many years. He used different investment return assumptions because he knew markets weren't guaranteed. He also included taxes, fees, maintenance, insurance, and estimated resale value. The spreadsheet didn't give him one magical answer. Instead, it showed him the trade-offs. A lease could potentially work better if someone valued flexibility, drove predictable mileage, and consistently invested the money they saved. Buying could potentially work better if someone planned to keep the vehicle long after the loan was paid off. Jake finally understood that the real comparison wasn't simply buy versus lease. It was lease plus what you do with the difference versus buy plus how long you keep the car. The behavior after the decision mattered enormously. Jake wanted a vehicle that worked with his financial goals rather than competing against them. Level 7. Jake's decision. The right choice depends on your life. After researching the numbers, Jake stopped searching for one universal answer. He looked at his own situation. He drove a lot, regularly traveled long distances, wanted to keep his next vehicle for many years, and cared about building wealth alongside his transportation budget. He also didn't want to restart a new vehicle contract every few years. For him, buying a reliable vehicle and keeping it for a long time made more sense. But Jake's decision didn't mean leasing was wrong. His neighbor worked remotely, drove very few miles, loved having the latest technology, and preferred replacing her vehicle every few years. For her, leasing could potentially be a reasonable option. Jake's brother had another situation entirely. He owned a small contracting business and needed a pickup truck to transport equipment. The vehicle directly supported his income, so its financial value wasn't simply personal transportation. Jake finally understood why people argue about buying versus leasing without ever reaching an agreement. They're often comparing completely different lifestyles. The best choice depends on income, mileage, expected ownership period, cash reserves, credit, vehicle type, and financial priorities. Jake's new rule was straightforward. Don't choose a car based on the payment alone. Choose based on the total cost and how well the vehicle fits your life. Jake walked away from the dealership with a completely different understanding of buying versus leasing. Leasing could provide access to newer vehicles, lower upfront costs, predictable contract terms, and flexibility. But mileage restrictions, wear charges, fees, depreciation, and the need to make another vehicle decision at the end of the lease can affect the long-term cost. Buying can require more money up front and potentially higher monthly payments, but eventually the loan can be paid off while the vehicle remains yours. If you keep it for many years, that can significantly change the overall economics. The real calculation isn't simply which has the lower payment. It's what will this car cost me from the day I get it until the day I stop driving it. You need to consider the down payment, interest, depreciation, insurance, maintenance, taxes, fees, mileage, resale value, and opportunity cost. And there's one final question Jake believes every buyer should ask. What could I do with the money I don't spend? Because the smartest car decision isn't necessarily the newest car, the cheapest car, or even the one with the lowest monthly payment. It's the one that provides the transportation you need without preventing you from building the financial future you want.